Dear Minister Dijsselbloem, dear Dr. Weise, Mr. Martin, Your Excellencies, dear friends, students, alumni, and colleagues, and last but not least, I would like to welcome especially Dr. Andres and the representatives of the Hertie Foundation. On behalf of the school's faculty, staff, students, and alumni, it is indeed a great honor to welcome you here this morning. And I think without the foresight, will, and perseverance, in particular of Dr. Andres, the Hertie School would not be what it is today, and perhaps not even exist at all. And I think for all what the Foundation has done and made possible, we're indeed truly grateful, and we thank the representatives of the Foundation for joining us today. Ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome you all to the Hertie School today and to the Symposium of Governance in Europe, taking stock for moving forward. And I would also like to thank our media partner, Deutsche Welle, for setting the tone with this short introductory film we just saw. We gather in this auditorium only 2 days after the European elections. In many regards, these elections echoed the sober experience which many Europeans have made with this feeble exercise of European democracy. A low turnout at a ballot box, but better than some would fear, a lack of genuine trans-European debate, the rise of right-wing populism, and uncertainty over how these elections will ultimately impact the formation of the European executive or European policymaking itself. Yet, ladies and gentlemen, it is important to keep the long-term perspective in mind. The promise of an ever closer union that has guided Europe from the Treaty of Rome to the present time rests on the evolution of democratic governance and economic prosperity. In profound ways, the long and complex process of European integration, now in its, or nearing its 7th decade, is an ongoing experiment in democratic governance and economic as well as social cooperation, if not integration, and is in scale and scope comparable to the founding of the United States of America, yet different in its political ambitions, culture, and context. Like the American promise of government of, for, and by the people, the distinct purpose of an ever closer union requires vision and innovations of many kinds. It requires new institutions and organizations, ways of doing things, and necessitates changes in the minds and hearts of citizens. It requires commitment and active participation across member states, and above all, in ways large and small. It requires visionary ideas to help Europe forward. It requires the contributions of many. It requires new programs bringing Europeans closer through increased mobility. It requires business executives seeing opportunities in building corporations across borders to strengthen Europe's economy. It requires civil society activists to connect Europeans around common causes and academics to advance the European project through analysis and reflection, or journalists and media personalities who help create a European public debate, and diverse local communities creating a sense of belonging. The European Union, the European project, is more than Brussels. It is more than the elections last Sunday. It is more than the euro, and is more than most can imagine. But we find it hard to fathom, let alone express, what this more might be. Calls for a new narrative fail to excite, and those voices wishing to halt the process of an ever closer union at some idealized balance of national and European interests find it easier to be heard. But these latter-day revisionists seem as idealistic and wrong-footed as the European enthusiasts of yesterday. For the EU, there is no way back unless we're willing to take into account great uncertainty and hardship, even conflicts, for decades ahead. Likewise, there is no way forward unless we're willing to take risks and face many unknowns for years to come. The outcomes will be uncertain in either case. It is up to us to help chart the course and point out options in terms of opportunities and dangers. It is therefore timely and fitting that we gather here today to take stock of governance in Europe and to discuss what could lie ahead. And I could imagine that there could be no better place today than here at the school to have that discussion. We see ourselves here at the Hertie School as a representative in our teaching, in our research, in our debates of what you might call a third policy approach, a European approach, if you wish, an approach that sets us apart from the primarily market-oriented policy model, the American model, and from the statist, let's say, Chinese model in Asia. We also believe that this European model is incomplete, that it is in danger, and it requires much thought and debate. And the very reason is behind that. That's why we gather here today. Ladies and gentlemen, this year is a very special one for the Hertie School. 10 years ago, the school was inaugurated with an international symposium which looked at the role of the state in the 21st century. That event laid out the changes that globalization had imposed on both the idea and the governance of the state, in this case very much the nation state. Addressing the process of European integration, Michael Zürn, the founding dean, and I'm glad to see him in the audience today, said that this process is notoriously slow and cumbersome, and that it lags behind the potential and the dynamics of globalization. Fast forward to today, and several crises later, we find ourselves compelled to agree with Michael Zürn. At the time that this school was founded, Europe's leaders and intellectuals drafted a constitution for Europe, only to see it fail the democratic test. The European Union had 15 member states back then. Today we have 28. Germany was Europe's sick man, you remember that too well, in dire need of economic reform. Lehman Brothers was still doing good business. Facebook had just been founded. Google was a cool and nifty upstart from California that seemingly could do no evil, and very few knew what NSA stood for. I do not need to remind you neither of the dramatic developments and changes that have taken place since, nor of the impact that these changes have had on our lives. Whether willingly or not, whether competently so or not, whether democratic or not, the European Union has emerged larger and perhaps even more powerful than in the past decade. Pressed to respond to the most serious fiscal and economic crisis in recent history, Europe wielded unprecedented influence over the fate of member states and their economies. While in 2004, we still grasped at what was happening to national sovereignty and the modern state, today we try to come to terms with how much decision-making on the most sensitive issues of our times has effectively shifted to Brussels and to an organization that most Europeans remain unfamiliar with or are becoming ever more skeptical of. Perhaps here is one core reason for the unease that many of us feel about Europe. As stated back in 2004, the purpose of the Hertie School is to focus on the demands and problems of modern governance in a changing world. Today, it seems that focusing on the single most experiment of governance beyond the state the world has ever witnessed, the European Union. In that, we have found our true calling and want to contribute to a better understanding of what is unfolding in this part of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, the next 2 days will lead us through academic presentations and debates about cutting-edge research, insights from distinguished policymakers, as well as, we hope, lively debate with a competent and diverse audience. We will assess the vote and what the recent elections mean for Europe. We will ask what reforms are needed for this continent to be both effective and to have a legitimate form of transnational government. Looking beyond the borders of Europe, and today most prominently so to the Ukraine, we will ask what Europe has to contribute to global governance. The future of a state in Europe will be assessed And we will conclude with a very special roundtable discussing the teaching of governance in Europe. And I'm very, very pleased to welcome the presidents, directors, and deans of some of the leading policy schools in this part of the world. And I very much hope that in the course of the next 2 days, we will be able to focus on Europe, but not be Eurocentric. And I think one of the weaknesses of the European debate is that we very often fail to see the world from outside in. We have a very focused view of Europe, and I think it's time for us to widen the debate and look at Europe in the world, and not the world of Europe only. We hope that the next 2 days will open interesting lines of discussion in this regard. Finally, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you our, if you wish, Master of Ceremony. And I never know the feminine form of that, but Melinda Crane. She's the chief political correspondent at Deutsche Welle and host of talk shows and political magazines. You'll also find her a frequent guest and commentator on television and radio in this country. Melinda studied history and political science at Brown, law at Harvard, and holds a PhD in political economy from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. We are very, very honored to have such a stellar host to guide us to the next 2 days. Thank you, dear audience, and thank you, Melinda. The stage is yours.